Hey, UConn students, I hope you're all doing well, hanging in there and continuing to stay positive with this whole thing. I just wanted to keep you updated. I sent y'all an email today, just asking you to respond with a yes to my email. A lot of you already have, so I appreciate that. Just administration is asking that we reach out to everybody to make sure they're getting our Google Classroom messages, assignments, things like that. If you don't respond, then you're probably going to be contacted by administration or central office or somebody, um, asking about what's going on and if you've been able to access the things that we've been sending. So, but other than that, hope everything's reasonably well. Um, and like they've been saying, this thing's going to get worse before it gets better, but it will get better. And it's just a matter of, kind of looking to that future. That's what I'm doing, and I'm going to make the most of this in the meantime and kind of share some resources with you that will help you write your paper. And then what I also want to do is just kind of end the Ben Sasse, Thomas Friedman conversation we were starting to have. For all means and purposes, Friedman, it kind of goes into detail in the rest of the book. The book was rather long. It was like 600 some odd pages, I think. But the Ben Sasse's book is pretty much, it's got one more chapter. So I'll just go through some of that today as well to kind of put a period on that and talk to you a little bit about our unit having a voice. And as you know, we were looking at the different groups in our country who have worked for a long time in getting a political voice so that they would be heard. We mentioned last time the struggle after the Civil War and Reconstruction eras that African Americans had. I do have the introduction to the civil rights book, The Arc of Justice, which talks about the United States of America in 1925. I might just read you a little bit of that each day. It might not take long, but it's kind of a neat introduction that kind of tells you a story about what life was like in the 1920s for, right in the Detroit area, if you were alive then. And it's kind of a neat way to do it. So I may do that. So the resources I'm giving you, remember, I'm uploading things to the website. Those are things to help you answer your paper question. I'll continue to do that, provide you with resources as we go. And that is due April 17th. Again, contact me if you have any questions. I already got one. If you do decide to cite, Chicago Turabian would be great if you want to do that. You don't have to again, but I think that's a good practice and habit for you to get into. I haven't seen, what is it, Tiger King that everybody's talking about? I may. Before too long, I'm actually watching a couple other shows right now that just started. The seasons are kind of going, and kind of watching that right now. But I will be interested in doing that. I'm also reading a book on something called transhumanism, which I talk to philosophy about. Maybe I'll talk to you about a little bit too. It's kind of interesting stuff. But what I want to do today, and I've uploaded this to the website, is kind of talk to you about the civil rights era. Many times when you hear civil rights, you think African Americans, which clearly there was a huge need for African Americans to fight for civil rights, and it was a major movement in our country. But just remember that there were other groups too. And even me, as I start to unwind and unpack who these groups were, there's a chance that we won't be able to spend time on a lot of them that deserve to be mentioned. So today what I want to do is kind of look at the Mexican American population, and more specifically the migration that occurred in our country between 1910 and 1920. There was a Mexican Revolution that occurred, and nearly, a million people or more emigrated, which means they left. Starts with an E, so the way I remember it is E is exit. To emigrate means to exit. Immigrate sounds like in. That reminds me that that's people coming in. But a million Mexicans came into the United States Southwest between the years of 1910 and 1920. So we had a great migration, as we talked about last time, from the south to the north. We also had a great immigration from our perspective, emigration from their perspective, where 1 million people came into the southwest part of the United States. Um, by the throes of the Great Depression, there were some 3 million Mexican people of Mexican descent living in our country. So that's just about the size of Connecticut, a little bit more actually, of people that were living in the Southwest United States that were from Mexico. And what ends up happening, as you can imagine, so if you think of this group that came in 1910, 30 years later, as they have children of their own and maybe grandchildren even, they're developing their own culture. And so the culture they develop is going to be a little bit of their Mexican heritage and a little bit of their American heritage. And just think of it, neither one is going to be complete because they have, two different cultures that they're kind of being brought up with and being passed down to them. So what ends up happening during this time is they employ their own fashion. They begin to dress a certain way. And young adults about your age began to wear something called zoot suits. They called them zoot suits, which were kind of these extravagant suits that primarily Mexican males wore, that were kind of full-length suits with hats and kind of fancy looking, and really made them stand out for good. Or in this case, in many cases, it led to a lot of problems. So World War II and so remember, in the Great Depression, there's a lot of battle and a lot of competition over jobs. What you see happen is you see this massive influx of Mexicans from south of the border between 1910 and 1920. So our economy is doing great in the 1920s, the roaring 20s, right? By the time the 30s roll around, though, our economy is struggling like it is worldwide. And more Mexicans actually leave the United States than enter for the first time. By the way, that connects to what was happening in our country anyways during the 30s. For the first time in American history, more people left our country than came in. And surprisingly, roughly 100,000 people moved to the Soviet Union, the communist Soviet Union, because there they were at least promised a kind of an existence where they could get a job and things like that. But it was amazing when you look back at the amount of people exiting or leaving our country, where we had always been the land of opportunity. But you can imagine the Mexican Americans that were in the Southwest at this time, some of the things they encountered, like other groups throughout American history. But they found themselves segregated in swimming pools and movie halls, and they even had difficult interactions with the African American community in Southern California, and places like that. So there was quite a bit of tension during the 1940s when World War II takes place. Now remember, you have a large demand for factory work and for agricultural type work and things like that. So you have many Mexican Americans joining the workforce and playing a very important role in terms of our war effort, and a great number of the we see this happen. Well, because you have young Mexican Americans dressed in zoot suits during this time, interacting in an area where you tended to have a large presence of Navy individuals who are also of the same kind of age demographic, but a very different, in many cases, racial demographic. You begin to have these circumstances that starts to spark here some violence. And so we had a bunch of riots in LA that occur. There's something called a Sleepy Lagoon murder trial where the LAPD essentially detained some 600 Mexican-American teenagers after finding one of their number dead. So that created a lot of animosity about racism and things like that. And then we see that in 1943 in June, we see riots last, for several days that involve beatings and all sorts of stuff. More than 500 Mexican Americans are going to be arrested during this time. And it really becomes a battle between the naval officers, and the Mexicans. And the suits made them stand out, and then one side was blaming the other that riots were provoked by both sides, but massive violence happens, random beatings and things like that. And so this creates a rather large issue in the 1940s during our war effort, actually. And so this area, like Watts in California, is going to be the scene of race riots in the 1960s as well. So we see that there's a lot of discrimination against the Mexicans that are in this part of our country during these years. There seems to be a pattern of wanting to use different ethnic groups when the country demands it, when war happens in an emergency. But then a short time later, when there's competition for jobs, it seems like many Americans, at least in these areas, find it just fine to discriminate and maybe commit violence. So this is a big issue that occurs. So I put that up on the Google Classroom page, hoping that you'll just kind of read through it and think about that idea of having a voice. Did everybody have a voice? What were the challenges? Well, here we see some pretty big challenges for a large population. Think of the issues that we're still talking about today with the border and things like that, how this kind of started then and just kind of snowballed and continued to be a big issue as we've gone forward. The other thing that I'm going to put up eventually that I kind of started reading about too, going back to Newark with the African American population, is after World War II there's going to be urban housing and money that's going to be thrown at the problem in Newark, and a lot of issues come up there in terms of who do we give this housing to, who do we move out, do we find a place for them to live while they've been moved out. And very much like the crisis we're currently dealing with, so many questions and not a lot of answers. And we've been through this in American history before, these unexpected things that happen. And I always thought it was a bit unfair, no matter what political party you're a part of, to demand everybody to be able to kind of respond perfectly to situations like that when they're unprecedented. It's very difficult to imagine things like this happening on the scale that they did. But the I don't remember what I was going to say about that, but just the issues that come out of nowhere, soldiers returning home after World War II, and having to face these similar issues. Oh, I know. It was a connection. Last night in the press conference with the president, there was a question, well, what about the people who are undocumented that are in our country? Are they going to get aid? And, that's a big question, is people who are not here through legal means, what's going to happen to them? Are they going to be cared for at all? Is it going to be left up to the communities? Is it one of these, well, that's your problem type of thing? What is the issue? That's just one major, think of the number of hours that could be spent working on that issue alone, let alone with everything else we have going on. So very interesting time in American history right now. And just shifting gears to Ben Sasse's book, Them, which you see that despite us coming together in many ways as a country, we're still showing some good partisan divide here, right, on both sides. Nobody's innocent of this. So one of the things that he ends the book talking about we're better nomads now. A nomad is a wanderer, somebody who kind of always goes off in searching of something. And he talked about this idea that our country's changing, and I think you're seeing it in front of you. Our country's probably going to change in some significant ways from here on out. You'll be able to tell people in the future that you were there when it changed. You'll sound like me now. You'll be saying, "Hey, I remember when." But I think it's kind of true. The way that we pick things up, the way that we order food, the way, hopefully a lot of this isn't permanent, but it might be for a while. And some things you might even discover it's more efficient and it's better to do this way. So one of the things he brought up, I'm sure you've heard of Airbnb. If you haven't, it's a service that if you go to stay somewhere, you can rent a room out. Say that I wanted to rent a room out here. I lived in a nice area like out in California, and I could turn the room that you see behind me into a bedroom really quick. maybe I would offer to rent that out to people, and they would get recommendations where I wouldn't just be letting strangers into my house. I would be, but they would come with some recommendations from people. They're trustworthy, they're good people, and then people would do the same about me. You don't want to walk into a house where you could be in trouble either. So that's Airbnb. You could actually rent houses out for a month. Some people who have jobs that may entail them moving around quite a bit, staying in a certain place for a while, caring for someone that's sick. You can't buy a house while you're doing that, and renting a hotel room, you'll go broke pretty quick. So some people have left their houses open for things like that. That's going to change the way we interact with each other. How about the idea of car sharing? Maybe we don't want a huge payment, monthly payment as you get older to buy a car. Some of you may have one already. What about sharing a car? Calling, very much like, like a taxi, or some of the other services that we have today, where you can do that. Well, why not? If you just did that all the time, you didn't buy a car, but there was enough cars that there was always one available to you if you needed it. How much different that would be. Or the idea that if you had a tool, let's say, think of a tool, for instance, a hammer. You can use a hammer to break things, right? I'm better at breaking things than I am at fixing things. But if I had a hammer to fix something, once I'm done with that hammer, it sits in my shed until the next time I need it, which might not be for 6 months. So that's like lost opportunity there. Someone else, probably somewhere near me, needs a hammer, and would now have to go purchase one or buy one. Well, what if we didn't own our tools? What if I just typed in, I said, I need a hammer. It's delivered just like the mail within a short amount of time. I get done with it. I put it back in the sleeve that I just got it in, and someone comes and picks it up. That's going to change the way we do it. The sharing of more things. What is that? I'm trying to remember the car service that we see commercials on, where they deliver the car to you. You buy a car. And that company was in a great deal of trouble, actually, days before this happened. Well, what do you think now? All of a sudden, I guarantee you that has turned around. That the carport idea, that you don't have to go and physically in person and do that. Some people will be freaked out by this quite a bit, is another thing to think about. And so some of these businesses that are being created right now may stick around. So as much as things get bad, and I'm really feeling for people that are losing their jobs right now, my heart really goes out to them. But one of the optimistic things to look at was whenever massive jobs are lost, there's always a positive counter side to that another job is created or people start doing things differently. Something to think about. I had heard, so don't take this at face, for gospel or anything, but I had just heard that because, there's some concerns with us in China, that maybe some of those businesses that Thomas Friedman talked about that were outsourced might be coming back. And remember, a town like Torrington used to kind of hang its hat on business like that, on industry and manufacturing. Who knows what the future could be here. So there's a lot of positives. The gas prices are really low. There's a president said that they could be as low as 99 cents. I think they are in some places. That's good for you and I, putting gas in our car. So we benefit, but other people lose out. They might lose a job because prices have crashed so much, and companies will suffer. But just some ideas there that we'll have to work together more in the future in some ways, even if it is virtually more than in person to person. And then he kind of ends the book and talks about the idea that a good rivalry always requires a good deal of similarity. The best rivalries involve similarities. And he brings that up again to talk about the difference between Republicans and Democrats, and getting us to focus on, what are we both trying to do? Are we always right about everything? Is there a chance that sometimes the other side could be right? And maybe we need to listen and open up dialogue and think about that. Rivalry, us and Naugatuck, right? You would say in the sports world, we're a pretty big rival, at least in this area. And one amazing thing, I talked to the baseball coach, before games and stuff when we compete all the time because our communities are so similar. We really are. We're old manufacturing towns. The demographics are largely the same between us and Naugatuck, and yet we have this huge rivalry with them. Well, they're kind of very similar to us, and we probably have a lot in common with them. And that's important to remember. The Red Sox and the Yankees are rivals because of geography. They're not exactly the same amount of distance from us here in Torrington, but they're pretty close. And one's Boston, one's New York. They both have a loyal fan base. And we may be friends in every other area except the baseball team that we support. But we have a common thing there. Both, think about that. We're all struggling with not seeing sports right now for sports fans, and it doesn't matter what team you root for. I can have a dialogue, and people that I would be going at it with over, who won last night, who's going to win the division. We're now like, boy, this really stinks. And yeah, it does, and we're having these conversations because of our similarities. So he kind of ends by saying, if we would focus on that, get back to our communities, what community makes you do is live with each other, even though you're different. You're on the same team in a certain sense. We're all on this. How often have you heard that in the news right now? We're all on the same team in this. And it's a great unifying thing. And we're going to see that it can have real positives that happen. Quite honestly, I'm not sure too many people, even if they're really rallied on one side or the other politically, really enjoy listening to partisan fights at this time. Some of it might be unavoidable because you have to make decisions about things, but we really, and I think that's the purpose of his book, Them, to start to look at each other as human beings, even human beings that we might radically disagree with, but we have a lot more in common many times than we have differences. And think of what we're studying in American history here, how different things could have been had more of that been recognized. That all of us most of us came to this country from somewhere else, our ancestors. And now this new generation that we feel threatened by and we're persecuting, well, geez, that happened to us many years ago. Was that a good thing? If you could go back, would you have saved your ancestors from that? Well, if your answer is yes, then why are you doing it now? Maybe cooperation is the way to go in terms of making more money, being safer. That saying you've probably heard, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, if that village is divided and at each other's throats, you may not want your child to go out. And that's not a good way to think of things. So that village needs to be unified as a village. Something that unifies everybody. So I think that's the point of Ben Sass's Them. Anyways, I was glad to share that with you, and certainly Thomas Friedman's book that talks about the flattening of our world and the equal playing field. This is doing this now. Imagine somebody who develops a vaccine here. We're assuming it's going to come from this country. What if it doesn't? What if it comes from a third world country where very educated people are, very smart people can do this? Maybe they'll do something that stops the spread of the virus that we need. Despite all our resources, maybe something that we need we don't have and they do. Well, you're going to see how flat that world can get real quick if that's true. And then just our interactions with China, how this is going to upset things again. It may not, but we'll just see what happens. But anyways, that's pretty much it for today. Just continuing to kind of update you as best I can and get me those emails if you would. I'm thinking about you all the time. I miss our, just the interactions we have in class and the laughter, and I just miss listening to you and all the tea you spill and all those other things. And you don't think I hear, I do, but I miss that, and I miss joking around with you. I miss some of you I talk to consistently. I miss that. So, anyways, hang in there, smile, take care of yourselves, get some fresh air if you can, stay away from each other the best you can, and looking forward to seeing you virtually real soon, and then hopefully seeing you in person a short time later. Take care.